Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished leader from the social sector world from London, UK, Mr. Nick Grono. Nick Grono, welcome to the show, sir.
Ashutosh, it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. Nick is the Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Fund. He's also an author, and all of you know that I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of a book titled How to Lead Nonprofits. So, Nick, before we talk about nonprofits and the work that you're doing, tell me about your own journey. Just before we started recording, you said you're from Australia.
Yes, so I'm Australian. I started off my career as a corporate lawyer, working for what is now one of the world's leading international law firms.
Mm-hmm.
I then came to London for a couple of years. I worked for Goldman Sachs, the investment bank in
Yeah.
London.
Mm-hmm.
Then went to work for government. I was Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor to the Australian Attorney General.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I went to the US and studied for a while. And from there, I entered into the social sector world.
Okay.
I joined a non-profit called the International Crisis Group, which works
Mm-hmm.
on conflicts around the world. And then 10 years ago, I took up my current role as CEO, the first CEO of the Freedom Fund, which works
Mm-hmm.
on modern slavery and human trafficking around the world.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more about the Freedom Fund.
So we work, as I said, on the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking, a crime that afflicts some 50 million people around the world
Mm-hmm.
in every country, from the UK to India, across the globe. And it's a situation where people are exploited. They are coerced and forced to work to provide labor or to provide sex.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sex trafficking, forced marriage, bonded labor, forced organ donations, those kinds of horrendous crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we partner with grassroots organizations all around the world, some
Mm-hmm.
150 organizations, to try and drive change from the grassroots up, because we think that's a really powerful way of driving change.
Amazing. So let's come to your book now, and our conversation today will be focused more on the work that you've done and that's led to your book. Uh, what motivated you to write your book, How to Lead Nonprofits?
Well, as I said, my career started in the corporate world, and I've worked for government. So I've kind of worked for all the big three sectors:
Yeah.
corporate, government, and the social sector, nonprofit sector.
Mm.
And what really struck me when I started working in the nonprofit sector, was that leadership is quite different.
Yeah.
And yet, so one thing, leadership is quite different. Two, there is relatively little material written on nonprofit leadership. I mean, there
Mm.
are hundreds of thousands of books written about business leadership, new books every single day.
Yeah.
There is very little that is geared to the nonprofit leader.
Mm.
And on the other side of the equation, there is a huge thirst by nonprofit leaders for guidance,
Mm.
for the specific circumstances of nonprofit leadership. And
Yeah.
hopefully we can explore some of the differences between business and
Absolutely.
nonprofit
Yes.
leadership.
Yes.
And so I thought there was a need, and there was a need to write from a practitioner's perspective. And
Mhm.
I was fortunate enough to get a sabbatical. So I took that time a couple of years ago to start writing the book.
Very interesting. So then before I ask you some of the top priorities for a nonprofit CEO, what are the differences between leading a nonprofit versus a for-profit?
I think there are two main differences. And the first is that working out impact for business is very clear, right?
Mm.
It's your financial returns, it's your returns on investment. You
Right.
may have other purposes that you are seeking to achieve, but first and foremost, particularly for public companies, and I know you work for British Aerospace, you'll
Mm.
be judged on your financial returns.
Mm.
Whereas for a non-profit, there isn't a clear metric of success. You are judged on impact. That
Mm.
may be on reducing hunger, addressing education of girls,
Mm.
addressing health around the world. Very, very difficult to measure
Right.
robustly in a way that you can compare against
Mm.
others. So whereas your ability at a business to have a clear metric and then drive accountability through the organization and have a sense of discipline and direction, it's much more challenging for nonprofits.
Right.
So that's the challenge. But the advantage they have is they are working to change the world,
Mm.
right? And a lot of businesses these days are talking about their purpose.
All right.
Well, non-profits have a clear purpose.
Mm.
I can't think of anything more important than working to tackle modern slavery and human trafficking, or to
Absolutely.
reduce conflict around the world, or
Mm.
hunger, or all those issues. So there's a powerful motivating force that you have as a non-profit leader, and you have to kind of work out how to use that to balance out the fact that you don't have a clear metric of impact and clear accountability.
Well said. And what would you say are some of the top priorities for a nonprofit leader when building an effective organization?
So when I started with the Freedom Fund a decade ago, I mean, the first thing I was most focused on was the vision for the organization.
Mm.
We have this powerful purpose. So how do I use the purpose, set the direction of travel, right? Set a clear objective, bearing in mind we don't have these kind of financial imperatives,
Mm.
to motivate the team, motivate funders, bring everyone around a central purpose. That's absolutely key.
Mm.
And then it was about building the team, the strategy, and then fundraising. Right? The bane of every nonprofit leader's life is that you
Mm.
have to raise funds. You have to persuade
Correct.
people to give you money day in and day out.
Mm. Interesting. And your response gives me a segue to my next question, that how do you maintain your mission and your focus within the team when you are constantly faced with the external pressure of funding?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a real dilemma.
Mm.
It's very easy for me to say you must maintain a focus on your purpose and your mission. But
Mm.
what happens when a funder comes to you and says, "We'll give you a big chunk of money if you do something different"?
Mm.
Right now, it's not a binary answer or a binary question. You
Yeah.
can kind of explore that and say, well, look, this is close to our mission. We can adjust. It fits our overall purpose. But if it's way off mission,
Mm.
you know, then you have to consider very strongly about not taking that funding if
Mm.
you can't persuade the donor to kind of give you something that's more related to your actual work. Because
Yeah.
in the end, if you drift way off mission, you won't be achieving your key purpose. And if you try and do everything, you will
Mm.
succeed in, at pretty well nothing. So,
Mm.
so it requires a constant discussion and a focus, and a lot of persuasion to try and keep everyone
Well
aligned
said.
with the
I agree.
fundamental purpose of the organization.
I agree. Your book also highlights the need for authenticity in leadership. How does vulnerability play into nonprofit leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think these days everyone talks about authenticity, don't they? And everyone says, I want to be authentic. And I think a lot of people actually act at being authentic as
Yeah.
opposed to genuinely showing authenticity. I think vulnerability is important because it's hard to fake vulnerability. I mean, if you are genuinely talking about challenges, issues, failures,
Mm.
that is showing a degree of vulnerability. In my book, I talk a lot about things I got wrong,
Mm.
right? And people respond to that. One, because they have shared experiences. I
Mm.
mean, by far the strongest feedback I've got from other nonprofit leaders is it was so empowering to read about mistakes that I've made and failures that I've experienced
Mm.
because they all struggle with all of this and it gives them an opportunity to understand, well, all of us are sharing this problem.
Mm.
I also think I'm a big believer in creating empowered teams. And if you are willing to admit to your team that you make mistakes and you get things wrong, it creates a much better space for
Correct.
people to engage and invest and share.
Mm. Well said. And I would love to get your perspective on some of the challenges to recruit the right kind of people for nonprofits. And what are some of these challenges that you face?
There's a big challenge with recruiting for nonprofits, which relates to the nonprofit nature that we've already talked about. There's a
Yeah.
challenge and there's a benefit. So,
Mm.
and it's about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation,
Mm.
right? Obviously, many of us are understandably motivated by extrinsic factors, pay, salary,
Mm.
working conditions.
Mm.
And the reality is that certainly big for-profit corporations can offer
Mm.
better pay and better salary, better conditions, better benefits. On the other hand, as I said, there's a huge motivation, and it's an intrinsic motivation about working for good.
Mm.
Surveys of businesses have shown that the vast majority of staff at for-profit organizations would sacrifice some of their salary for more intrinsic motivation.
Mm.
They want more purpose in their life.
Mm.
So, the challenge I have at the Freedom Fund is to build a strong culture where
Mm.
people are motivated, and we get amazing staff who
Yeah.
come because they're deeply motivated and passionate about the work. We
Mm.
try and pay well, even if we can't pay, at corporate levels. We try and pay above the average in the non-profit sector
Mm.
because I think staff deserve to be well
Yeah.
remunerated.
Yeah.
And I lean into purpose.
Mm. Well said. Can you talk a little bit about some of the insights on embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion within a nonprofit organization?
Yeah, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI gets a lot of attention these days,
Correct.
particularly in, the US, where it's become an ideological kind of punching bag,
Absolutely.
which is very sad. My starting point is we need the best possible talent in our
Mm.
organization.
Mm.
And the best possible talent comes regardless of race, gender, caste,
Absolutely.
ethnicity, and I think it's incumbent on us to
Mm.
overcome the barriers, and often structural and societal barriers to get the very best staff. I
Mm.
mean, in my space, an issue I work on, the people who have had lived experience of being trafficked are
Mm.
experts on the issue of trafficking,
Correct.
and bring huge expertise and knowledge about what needs to be done.
Mm.
And so, as an organization, we are actively trying to recruit more
Mm.
people with lived experience.
Mm.
And so, I just think it's a no-brainer to try but you have to work at it because, organization can be conservative and you might hire from the traditional universities and you might hire people like you, right? That's a natural tendency. And we
Mm.
work very hard at the Freedom Fund, and we don't
Mm.
always succeed, but we
Yeah.
work very hard to overcome that to make sure that we have the most diverse pool
Mm.
of expert staff,
Yeah.
and we benefit hugely from that.
Absolutely. I agree. One more question relating to people, and then I want to move to partners. What are your thoughts on future proofing nonprofit talent to handle emerging social and organizational challenges?
I think it's very hard, and I think the times that we are going through are some of the most challenging times of my lifetime,
Mm.
right? In terms of division and breakdown in trust and those kinds of issues. And there's always a temptation for every generation to say that, but it is really difficult.
Yeah.
And I think we have to work. I think nonprofits have a huge benefit, as I keep on coming back to, about being able to motivate people around
Mm.
purpose. And I
Mm.
know Gen Z, you know, um, are a very different kind of candidate of caliber and employee
Mm.
these days, and they're much
Mm.
more focused on the meaning of work than just the extrinsic motivation.
Mm.
That's all what the research shows.
Mm.
Staff are looking for young staff are looking for purpose, and so certainly I see for the nonprofit sector that's something we need to lean into. And I think that there is a role for the nonprofit sector in times of much greater division to play a role in supporting civil society and helping people come together around good causes.
Mm. Well said. So I'm now going to move to partners and the need to work with external shareholders, stakeholders. And I served on the board of Gavi for eight
Right.
years in Geneva.
Right.
And I know how important it was for the management team to work with multiple stakeholders. So my first question is, how do you keep the voices and needs of the people you have at the center of partnerships?
Well, it gets back to, the question you had about diversity, equity, inclusion. The
Mm.
people we serve are the people who have the greatest understanding of what needs to be done.
Right.
And so it's not just a slogan or, not paying lip service to it. We benefit from putting them and their voices at the center of the work. We
Mm.
partner and fund with over 150 grassroots, community-based frontline organizations with a tremendous wealth of knowledge and expertise. So we work hard to make sure that we co-create strategies together. We've just done a whole big strategic review process, and as part of, our annual strategic planning review, and we set up working groups of our partners and community representatives. We surveyed them
Mm.
because, their voices and input are absolutely key to determining what we need to do.
Mm.
So I think it's a muscle, right? It's a reflex that you have to develop. Beyond just the lip service, because I think there's
Mm.
a whole history in the non-profit sector of very colonial type approaches of going into countries, establishing big expat teams, kind
Mm.
of top down. We know what you need. We know how to, and it's hugely arrogant, but even worse, it's not nearly as effective
Mm.
as a much more humble and a much more inclusive approach
Mm.
of putting those that you are serving at the center of what you are doing.
Mm. Great response. Nick, my next question is, how can nonprofits balance the needs of funders? And you partly answered this earlier as well. But for people whose money that you are taking, How do you balance their needs while staying true to your own mission?
Well, I think the starting point is to understand there is a huge power disparity, right?
Mm,
Funders have a lot more power than the organizations they
correct.
fund
Correct.
because they can fund anyone,
Yeah.
whereas we have a limited pool of funders.
Mm,
So that's the starting point. But then I think it's also understanding that it's not just a one-way relationship, right? Funders gain from being part of really
correct.
impactful work.
Mm,
There is a huge joy and a satisfaction out of making a real impact on tremendously important social
yeah.
justice issues.
Yeah.
And so I think it's understanding that there is that kind of mutual relationship, while
Mm,
not pretending it's an entirely equal relationship.
yeah.
It's about building relationships. It's
Mm,
about I mean, we bring our funders out to see the work, meet our partners, understand firsthand, create a
mm,
sense of commitment. And I think it's investing, and it's not just treating your funders as a cash book, right, or as
mm,
a checkbook, but
correct.
treating it as a genuine partnership. Not always
Absolutely.
easy,
Mm,
but it helps tremendously if you can do that.
mm. And one of the other things that I've seen with a lot of nonprofits who are raising money is that they are constantly trying to build a long-term relationship with funders. What is your perspective on what goes into creating a long-term relationship?
Well, so the Freedom Fund was founded by three foundations.
Hmm.
One is called Walk Free in
Hmm.
Australia. One is called Legatum, based in Dubai, and one is called Humanity United, based in the US.
Hmm.
Each of them were with us 11 years ago. Each of them are still significant funders today.
Hmm.
So long-term committed relationships, and many of our other funders have been with us since our very early years. And I
Hmm.
think it is about making sure that they feel that the work is really impactful.
Hmm.
We spend a lot of time understanding and a lot of research on the impact of our work and trying to show how our work and why our organization is hugely effective. So we're
Hmm.
making the case to funders that this is a
Hmm.
really good investment. You know,
Hmm.
if you care about this issue, we are one of the best organizations, if not the best,
Yeah,
to invest in.
well said.
And funders want value for money. They want impact. They want to understand their money.
Hmm.
You can't just go to
Hmm.
a funder and say, trust us, and we don't have to account for your money. And, you know, we'll come back in 3 years' time and ask for more money
Hmm.
without explaining to you what we've done.
Yeah,
So, I mean, it's treating a relationship with respect and understanding their priorities as well as our own.
amazing. Thank you. And how can nonprofits navigate collaboration with peer organizations while maintaining their own unique identity?
I think the starting point is to understand that all of the issues we work on are so huge that we won't succeed without mobilizing many, many, many other actors. I mean, you're at Garvey, you know, I'm working on modern slavery, human trafficking, 50 million people. Our organization, our organization has an income of about $20 million a year.
Hmm.
The annual profits from slavery and trafficking globally are over
Hmm.
200 billion a year.
Wow.
Right. So for us to have an impact, and we're probably the second or third biggest international organization working on it. So we're tiny,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And the only way we are going to have a real impact is by mobilizing others and bringing them
Hmm.
along in a journey. And
Hmm.
so it's just not a platitude. It's an essential strategy for us to
Hmm.
bring funders along, to bring peers along, to bring those that we support and partner with along. And that requires, so once you frame it that way, there's a real incentive to work with others to shape their understanding, to do the research that influences others, to influence governments, because that's the only way we'll have a real impact on an issue we care about
Hmm.
tremendously.
Well said. And what are some of the characteristics a nonprofit should look for in funders to ensure alignment with their own values?
Well, the holy grail of a funder relationship is a funder who gives you multi-year unrestricted funding. You know,
Mm,
instead of saying this funding is only to fund this particular program, or you can't spend any of your money on staff salaries.
mm,
And my response would be, well, you know, how do we do the work if we don't pay the staff,
correct.
right? And so that's the holy grail. That requires you to build a relationship of trust and understanding and explain why you need to invest in overhead.
Mm,
Right? Why do we invest in? We have financial systems in place. We have good financial systems. That costs us money, but it
mm,
ensures that money isn't wasted and misspent.
mm,
Right? We provide training and support to our staff because we then have an engaged and very effective staff complement that can ensure that we have even more impact, as well as then spending money on partners and all of the programs. So I
Right.
think it's about having a relationship of trust and sharing and trying to
Hmm.
um, explain why these investments will ensure ever greater impact.
Hmm. Well said. I've got time for two more questions for you. My next question is, how can technology be leveraged to enhance nonprofit partnerships?
I think technology is key. I think it's important to understand technology is a tool and usually not a solution.
Hmm.
Right. In my space, there's often a kind of an incentive to say, well, we can solve all of trafficking by,
Yeah.
some technical solution. Well, you don't understand, you
Yeah.
don't address deep-seated
Correct.
discrimination and exploitation and, racism and all of these
Hmm.
vulnerability factors for trafficking through a tech solution.
Hmm.
But of course, you can enhance your impact and you can do things much better. I mean, even ChatGPT is a huge boon if you use
Hmm.
it properly and
Yeah.
thoughtfully.
Yeah.
So I think, consistent with my theory that we need to be expert custodians of our funders' money, we have to think about how technology can accentuate our impact and can
Hmm.
enable us to do more and do it more cheaply
Fascinating.
and ever more effectively.
Fascinating. And my last question for you, what, in your view, does strategic networking play in building effective partnerships for nonprofits?
So I think networking is key. I think it's often misunderstood,
Hmm.
right? I think, some people think of networking as going into a room and handing out a business card. That's not networking. I
Yeah.
mean, that verges on offensive, that it's about building relationships,
Correct.
understanding there is a shared mutual
Hmm.
interest. And if you take the time to do that, then it's a win-win situation for
Hmm.
everyone involved.
Yeah.
And again, it comes together about building networks enables you to build a coalition to have greater impact on the issues
Hmm.
that you care about. So
Hmm.
I spend a lot of time thinking about building. And the other thing about networking is if you build a thoughtful relationship,
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be a transactional relationship. Some of the most interesting relationships I have are not with people who are working directly on a trafficking space or are funders, but
Hmm.
they are people who introduce me to you,
Hmm.
right, through Sonal Sachdev Patel, one of your
Yeah.
former guests,
Yeah.
and who is a wonderful friend
Hmm.
and hugely influential in the space
Hmm.
and part of my network.
Absolutely. And on that note, Nick, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. Thank you for speaking to me at such length about your book, How to Lead Nonprofits. And I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Nick Grono's book, How to Lead Nonprofits. Thank you for speaking to me about so many different aspects that you've covered in your book. We covered some interesting topics on funding challenges. We spoke about authenticity in leadership. We spoke about recruiting the right talent. We spoke about diversity, equity, inclusion. We also spoke about how to manage external stakeholders, how to go back to them for funding, and how to manage peer organizations as well. Thank you for speaking to me. Thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing for people of this world. And thank you for speaking to
Well, thank you, Ashutosh, for having me on and giving me a chance to speak to your audience. Thank you very
me.
much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.